Taoiseach, thank you for making time for us. This is your first visit to the United States as Prime Minister. What do you hope to accomplish?
Well, it is my first visit as Taoiseach. I'm very honoured to be able to come to Washington and participate in the traditional St. Patrick's Day celebrations and visit the White House and meet the President. What I hope to say to America is that Ireland is open for business. What I hope to say to America is that we want to rebuild the connections between our two countries, restore Ireland's reputation, which has been damaged somewhat around the world in recent times, and to say to American business that our fundamental attraction from a tax perspective of a 12.5% corporation tax rate remains intact and will remain intact. We want no ambiguity and no lack of clarity about that. So it's an occasion to, in some cases, meet people I've met before, but also to say that Ireland's got a new government, a really strong mandate, and we're looking to the future to restore our reputation and take our place truly among the nations of Europe and internationally.
The head of Ireland's central bank said today that they're looking at the possibility of foreign ownership of Irish banks. So do you plan to meet with members of the financial community while you're in the U.S.?
Well, some, but not directly in relation to that particular matter. Obviously, we want to have our banks operating privately without state assistance and do what they should do, what you'd expect them to do under proper regulation and circumstances. This is a challenge for Ireland, but obviously there have been options put on the table about equity and investment from foreign ownership in Irish banks, and as I say, we want to get to a point where you have competitive banking in private hands operating as it should.
Will we know soon how many of those foreign owners will be American banks? I mean, are we that close to closure?
No, we're not that close yet, but there have been some interest in a third banking force in Ireland with some American interest there. That hasn't been concluded yet, but obviously it's something that's being considered seriously by those who are involved.
You mentioned the corporate tax rate, 12.5%, big part of the attraction to do business in Ireland. So it's not negotiable, it's staying there. The EU rate is about 23%. Are you open to any negotiation to still have a corporate tax rate that's low, but perhaps higher than 12.5%?
No. Tax is a matter of national competence within the European Union. That's actually solidified in the Lisbon Treaty, which was voted on by the people of Ireland, and who were reminded by no less a person than President Sarkozy himself.
You said you had a bit of a Gallic spat, was that what you called it with him?
Well, Europe, as you know, is made up of 27 different countries, 27 different leaders. Obviously, they all have different views in some cases, so you have good, robust political discussion. And I expressed my view very clearly against what the French president was saying. And in that sense, if there were to be a debate at all about tax rates, it should be about the transparency of the rate. Ireland's is very transparent, and the difference between the effective tax rate and the statutory tax rate, insofar as corporate tax rates are concerned in Ireland, is 0.6%, the lowest of any country in Europe.
President Sarkozy, in relation to this matter, asked that you give something. He was trying to link the question of the structure of the bailout that Ireland received, some 85 billion euros, to the corporate tax rate there. Do you think that's a fair linkage?
No, it's not. These two things are entirely separate. The corporate tax rate in Ireland, or any other country, has nothing to do with the IMF EU bailout deal. And my case to Europe was that the deal was put together for two purposes. One, to achieve debt sustainability. That is, that Ireland in this case could pay its way, and at the same time increase our economy and trade our way out of this particular problem. But the fact is that the penal rates that are being applied at 5.89% are too severe. So prior to the election, recently, we made a case for an adjustment in the cost of this bailout deal, both in terms of the interest rate and in terms of the way that the bank structure is contained in there and the cost associated with that. And that's where we're discussing both with the ECB, the European Commission, and my colleagues around the table in Europe. And I'd remind you that, you know, when you sit around that table as European leaders, whether you're the leader of a small country like Ireland or the leader of a large country like France or Germany, they are all of equal status. But it's not correct to equate a conditionality of a reduction in interest rates with a condition that corporate tax rates be increased. They're entirely separate matters.
The head of the Eurogroup, Jean-Claude Juncker, said he thinks Ireland's being tortured by other governments in linking these two issues. Do you feel that way?
Well, Ireland's got great support from Europe over the years, and we have contributed to Europe. We have been strong supporters of every European referendum and treaty since the 1970s. Europe has a population of 500 million, enormous potential, and Ireland actually gave it the authority for its institutions to develop in the way they should, both from a Commission, Parliament and Council of Ministers point of view. So we've taken some pressure. That is true. Jean-Claude is a good friend of mine, and we're well able to stand up to that kind of challenge.
Pressure, not torture, is how you
Clarity is what we want here, and flexibility. Ireland wants to pay its way. Ireland wants to live up to its responsibilities, and it will. But we need some flexibility from Europe to help us achieve that, and I expect that we will get that.
You asked Eurozone leaders, though, last week for this, and they did reduce the rate that Greece has on their aid package, but they said no to Ireland. Why do you think they did that?
Well, Greece is not in the EFSF package, right. And there was the approval of the principle of a reduction in the interest rates. The IMF from Washington here itself said that the interest rate in this package was too high, and that's been concluded in the agreement that countries within the EFSF package should have their rates reduced. Ireland's the only one in there, and I thought it quite unfair to expect a condition be attached to that in respect of a raising of interest rates. Now, let me make it clear. Ireland will always, discuss constructively with our European colleagues the future of Europe. And in respect of the Competitiveness Pact, which is put forward by France and Germany, we're quite prepared to discuss that, but not the question of raising corporate tax rates or harmonisation of a common consolidated corporate tax base.
So, discussing it, would you ever put it to a referendum, one which you would assume the Irish people wouldn't necessarily pass, to allow for that kind of discussion? Well,
we actually had two referenda in effect. The first was the Lisbon Treaty, right. Where it was written in as an addendum to that tax matters are clearly a competence for each individual country, and I respect that, as I'm sure others do. And secondly, in respect of the recent general election, where my government was given the biggest mandate in the history of the state, part of that mandate was on the basis of getting an improvement in the terms of the the IMF-EU bailout deal. And our challenge politically is now to look to the future, because I want to see a day as soon as possible where we can remove ourselves from this package, get back to the bond markets as a sovereign country, and be in charge of our own economic and sovereign destiny.
Big part of that is going to be the test towards the end of the month in terms of establishing the amount of capital that Irish financial institutions will need. This will be yet another stress test. To be frank, Ireland lost credibility with the past stress tests because the Irish institutions, many of them were declared fine and yet needed capital afterwards. Yeah. So what's different this time around? How do you restore the reputation?
I think there's a very highly rated international group dealing with the stress test on this occasion, together with the IMF. So what's going to emerge from that, I hope, will be absolutely clear. We would expect that there will be some more clarity next week on the work that's evolving as part of that stress test. But I think it is important that when you deal with something as serious as this, that you be able to deal accurately with the facts. And until the stress tests are actually produced, we won't know the extent of what that liability might be.
Do you expect it to be, your finance minister says it'll be probably more than 10 billion euro. Would you expect it to be?
Well, I've heard some extreme figures being mentioned from a European perspective. Obviously, I don't want to comment on any particular figure here, but it may well be that in respect of the deleveraging of assets from the banks, that when projections were carried out before, these were of an extreme order, were you to have a forced sale of assets at huge reductions. So I think that's understood now by the ECB to a great extent, but until the figures from the stress test become very clear, you won't actually know the truth of the extent of the liability, be it higher or lower than what has already been mentioned.
Are you still, when it comes to international confidence in Ireland and the financial system, there's also the question of the status being given to bondholders, those financial stakeholders in all of this, right? So when it comes to the idea of imposing losses on bank bondholders. Where do you stand on that question?
Well, we made our position clear on this. We believe that no further monies should go into banks beyond what's already committed until you see the scale of what the liability is and until there's an understanding of how that burden might be shared.
Stress test, right?
Yes.
So with that, though, when you look at the yields in the marketplace on Irish bank debt securities, it shows that there's the assumption that there will be some sort of haircut for bondholders. What more can you tell us?
Well, I can't tell you any more except that these are matters that are all going to be discussed once the position becomes absolutely clear. We had the Eurozone meeting last Friday. Our Minister for Finance spoke to the European Commission on Monday and to the European Central Bank. A meeting of the Ministers for Finance in Brussels this week. Obviously, I'll have more discussions with my European colleagues before we get to the meeting of the 24th, 25th. These are important issues and you don't want to lead anybody astray about them.
How do you decide in these negotiations, in these types of meetings, where Ireland's best interests begin and end and where those of the ECB's begin and end? Because when you talk to Trichet, when you talk to Eurozone leaders, they're looking at the whole of the continent and beyond, not necessarily Ireland's first priorities.
No, of course, and the ECB has put huge amounts of money into the Irish financial system, and the ECB have made it clear that they're not going to withdraw from that. So that's confidence in its own way. But obviously, there's a challenge here that we have to meet, and we will meet that challenge, but we need some flexibility in order to do so. This is not a case of Ireland going to renege upon its trust or upon its responsibility, but we need cooperation and understanding from Europe and how we're going to achieve that target.
You talked about the interest rate being paid on the bailout. When we saw that bailout happen in the international financial markets, there was at first some relief and then there was concern that there was going to be more debt added on to a situation that was essentially a debt crisis. And I know you agree with that because you've campaigned along these lines, but looking at this, when you're adding bank debt onto sovereign debt, do you foresee a situation in which default becomes possible or inevitable?
Well, when the interest rates were set in the beginning, based on the formula from the IMF and together with the EU, there was the question of moral hazard, as they call it, that you might get into a situation where you'd have low interest rates being repaid and therefore no initiative from any particular country to actually get out of the difficulty in the first place. But it's not as if Ireland want to get into a package. We are in a package which is very challenging, which has resulted in people's lifestyles being impacted upon, salaries being reduced, charges and new taxes being imposed upon people. And they want to see an end to this, which is why you need a vision of where it's actually going to come to an end and that the country can start to grow and trade our way out of it. So in that sense, we are in this package now. Our political challenge is to have a point where we can exit from that and borrow for productive purposes in terms of job creation and investment.
When it comes to some of the Irish financial institutions, you are seeing in the marketplace worry still, that being priced in there. And you've seen from the ratings agencies them sending signs of worries as well about downgrading some of the covered bond programs. So do you see any risk of default?
Well, I'd like to see a situation where there's a distinction between our sovereign debt and our bank debt. Obviously, I've made the point on many occasions that I think it's grossly unfair to expect the taxpayer to have to pay 100% for the reckless lending practices of banks, which caused this in the first instance. And that's a matter for discussion between ourselves and the ECB and our European colleagues. You don't want a situation where you're in a package which is quite austere and very challenging, and you attempt to make your payments, but you can't grow your economy at the same time. And the package was designed for a particular purpose. In our view, it's not going to work for the purpose for which it was designed. Therefore, it should be changed and adjusted. And we've pointed out areas where that adjustment and change should actually take place.
Do you believe there's some sort of quid pro quo that Eurozone leaders are entitled to have?
Well, I've already made the point to the Eurozone leaders that in respect of the Competitiveness Pact, the Irish government is quite willing to discuss constructively things that might take place there to improve Europe's and everybody else's competitiveness. Mm-hmm. But I'm not prepared to compromise on something that is the individual competence of each country in respect of our corporate tax rates, and I've made that perfectly clear. These things, in my view, are not related. But Ireland is willing to contribute constructively to the discussion about competitiveness, as we joined in the language of the agreed pact on competitiveness just last week at the Eurozone meeting.
Is this finally next week, after you leave this nation's capital, there's meeting in Brussels March the 24th, 25th. Do you expect to have any kind of agreement at that point?
Well, before then, I expect to have some greater clarity on the work that is being undertaken by the stress test people in respect of the banks. I think that's going to give us some greater clarity as to where we go. I know that Europe itself obviously wants all the countries of Europe to be able to stand up and make their way for the future. We have a challenge here. It's a challenge that we will meet, and I'll explain again to our European colleagues the ways in which they can show us flexibility by which we can meet their targets and our targets, which will be good for Ireland and good for Europe.
Well, we'll be watching. Thank you so much.
Thank you indeed.
For making time for us.